In the deep and ancient silence of the prehistoric world, where the earth was vast and wild and untouched by modern noise, the early humans found their sanctuary within the hollows of the stone cliffs. They lived in a time when the rhythm of life was dictated entirely by the rising and setting of the sun and the slow turning of the seasons, which brought with them the changes in the wind and the rain and the temperature of the air. The caves were their homes and their fortresses against the elements and the predators that roamed the dense forests and the open plains outside. These natural structures, formed by the slow erosion of water over millions of years, provided a stable and secure environment where the small groups of people could rest and sleep and carry out the simple daily tasks of survival. The entrance to the cave was usually chosen carefully to face away from the prevailing winds so that the cold drafts would not penetrate deep into the living space where the family slept. Inside the cave, the floor was often uneven and covered with dust and loose stones, but over time, the movement of feet would smooth the surface, creating a familiar path that led from the bright opening into the dim and quiet recesses of the shelter. The light from the sun would only reach a certain distance into the cave, leaving the back areas in perpetual shadow, where the temperature remained constant and cool throughout the year, regardless of the scorching heat of summer or the biting cold of winter. Near the entrance of the cave, the early humans would build their hearths, where the fire was kept burning day and night to provide warmth and to cook the food they had gathered or hunted during the daylight hours. The fire was the heart of the home, and its flickering orange light cast long, dancing shadows against the rough limestone walls, which were often stained black from the smoke of countless fires that had burned in the same spot for generations. The wood for the fire had to be gathered daily from the surrounding forests, and this was a slow and repetitive task that involved searching for fallen branches and dry timber that would burn slowly and steadily without creating too much smoke. The smell of the burning wood mixed with the earthy scent of the cave created a unique atmosphere that signified safety and rest for the people who lived there. Around the fire, the ground was often covered with layers of dried grass and leaves and animal furs, which served as rudimentary beds and seating areas where the people could sit and work on their tools, or simply rest and stare into the flames as the day slowly turned into night. The preparation of sleeping areas was a crucial part of their daily routine because a good night of sleep was essential for having the energy to face the challenges of the next day. They would collect soft moss and ferns from the forest floor and pile them up in the designated sleeping corners of the cave to create a barrier against the cold and hard stone beneath them. Over these piles of vegetation, they would spread the hides of large animals such as bears or bison or deer, which they had tanned and softened using simple stone scrapers and plenty of patience. These furs were heavy and warm and provided a comforting weight that helped the people to feel secure as they drifted off to sleep in the absolute darkness of the cave interior. The sounds of the night outside were muffled by the thick stone walls, but occasionally the cry of a nocturnal bird or the rustle of the wind in the trees would drift in, reminding them of the world outside. Inside the cave, the only sounds were the soft breathing of the sleeping group and the occasional crackle of the dying fire and the rhythmic dripping of water from a stalactite somewhere deep in the cavern. Water was another essential resource that determined where the early humans chose to live, and many caves were situated near clear running streams or had natural springs welling up from the rock within the cave itself. The daily collection of water was a task performed with quiet dedication, as they would carry the liquid in containers made from hollowed gourds or tightly woven baskets lined with clay or pitch to make them watertight. Living in the cave meant living in close proximity to one another, and this fostered a strong sense of community and shared purpose, where everyone had a role to play and the well-being of the individual was tied to the survival of the group. The days were spent mostly outdoors when the weather was fair, gathering wild berries and nuts and roots and tubers that grew in the fertile soils of the valleys and forests.
The act of gathering was slow and methodical, requiring a keen eye to spot the edible plants amongst the dense vegetation and the knowledge of which plants were safe to eat and which were poisonous. They would move slowly through the undergrowth, pushing aside the ferns and the tall grasses, feeling the texture of the leaves and the bark of the trees. Back in the cave, the gathered food would be sorted and prepared with great care. The roots would be peeled and roasted in the hot ashes of the fire until they were soft and sweet, and the nuts would be cracked open using smooth, round stones that had been selected specifically for their weight and shape. The crafting of tools was another activity that consumed many hours of their time and was often done in the quiet safety of the cave while the storm winds blew outside. They would sit cross-legged on the fur-covered floor with a piece of flint or obsidian in one hand and a hammerstone or an antler billet in the other. With precise and rhythmic strikes, they would flake away small chips of stone to create sharp edges and points that could be used for cutting meat or scraping hides or hunting game. The sound of the stone striking stone was a rhythmic clicking that echoed softly off the cave walls, creating a hypnotic beat that accompanied the slow passage of time. The process required intense focus and steady hands, and the repetition of the motion was calming and meditative, allowing the mind to rest while the hands were busy. The floor of the cave was often scattered with the tiny debris of this tool-making process, creating a layer of history that would one day tell the story of their lives to future generations. As the sun began to set and the light outside faded into the deep blues and purples of twilight, the people would retreat further into the cave and add more wood to the fire to build up the heat for the long night ahead. The transition from day to night was a gradual process that signaled the time for the body to slow down and prepare for rest. The cave offered a sensory deprivation that was perfect for sleep, as the deep darkness was absolute once the fire burned down to embers, and the silence was profound and heavy. The air inside the cave was free of the allergens and the dust of the outside world, making it easy to breathe deeply and rhythmically, which further encouraged a state of relaxation and drowsiness. The routine of cave life was consistent and predictable, with the same tasks being performed day after day in a cycle that was in harmony with the natural world. There was no rush and no urgency in their movements, as they knew that the work would always be there and that patience was a virtue that ensured survival. The walls of the cave sometimes served as a canvas for their creativity, and they would use pigments made from red ochre and charcoal and animal fat to draw simple figures of the animals they hunted and the world they saw around them. These paintings were often created in the deepest and most inaccessible parts of the cave, where the flickering light of a torch would make the animals appear to move and breathe on the uneven rock surface. But mostly, the cave was a place of simple existence, where the complexities of life were stripped away, leaving only the basic needs of shelter and warmth and food and rest. The feeling of safety provided by the solid rock overhead was a primal comfort that allowed the early humans to let go of their vigilance and surrender to the restorative power of sleep. They would huddle together for warmth, their breathing synchronizing in the quiet dark, creating a collective rhythm of life that persisted through the cold nights. The floor of the cave was cool to the touch, but the furs and the dried grass provided insulation that kept the body heat contained. The smell of the earth was always present, a grounding aroma that connected them to the land that sustained them. As they slept, the world outside continued to turn, with the stars moving slowly across the sky and the moon casting its pale light over the sleeping landscape. The cave remained a constant and unchanging refuge, a silent witness to the dreams and the slumbers of the people who called it home. The morning would come slowly, with the first gray light filtering through the entrance and waking the birds in the trees outside, whose songs would gently rouse the sleepers from their rest. They would wake up slowly, stretching their limbs and adding fresh wood to the embers of the fire to coax it back into a blaze that would chase away the morning chill. The cycle would then begin again, with the slow and steady pace of life that defined their existence in the age of stone and ice. Living in a cave was not a life of hardship, as we might imagine, but a life of simplicity and connection to the environment, where every object and every action had a purpose and a meaning. The stone walls were not a prison, but a protective embrace that held them safe while they slept and dreamed. The boring and repetitive nature of their days was a source of comfort and stability in a world that could be unpredictable and wild. The tasks of scraping skins and cracking nuts and chipping stone were the anchors of their reality, keeping them grounded in the present moment. The cave was a sanctuary of peace where the mind could settle and the body could.
The sun would climb higher in the sky, casting a bright and warming light over the valley below the cave entrance. The air would begin to warm up, and the dew on the grass and the leaves would slowly evaporate, rising as a thin mist that clung to the edges of the forest. The people would move with a leisurely pace as they stepped out of the cave and into the brightness of the day. Their feet were toughened by years of walking barefoot on the earth, and they could feel every texture of the ground, from the soft soil near the stream to the rough gravel on the hillside. They would walk in single file along the narrow game trails that wound through the trees, their eyes scanning the ground for tracks or signs of edible plants. The forest was a vast and green ocean of trees that stretched as far as the eye could see, and the canopy overhead was a shifting mosaic of leaves that filtered the sunlight into dappled patterns on the forest floor. The silence of the woods was deep and profound, broken only by the occasional rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth, or the distant call of a crow. They would stop frequently to examine a plant, or to listen to the wind, or simply to rest and conserve their energy. The act of walking was meditative and rhythmic, with the steady placement of one foot in front of the other, and the gentle swinging of their arms. They carried woven baskets and leather pouches slung over their shoulders, ready to be filled with whatever the land provided. Sometimes they would find a patch of wild strawberries growing in a sunlit glade, and they would spend hours picking the tiny red fruits one by one. The berries were small and sweet, and their juice would stain the fingers red as they collected them with gentle care. Other times they would find a grove of nut trees, and they would gather the fallen nuts from the ground, sifting through the dry leaves to find the hard shells. The repetitive motion of bending down and picking up and straightening up was a slow dance that they performed in silence. The wind would blow through the branches above them, causing the leaves to whisper and sigh, a sound that was constant and soothing. As the day wore on, the heat would increase, and the insects would begin to buzz in the tall grass. The bees would drone lazily from flower to flower, and the dragonflies would dart over the surface of the quiet pools of water. The early humans were attuned to these small movements and sounds, regarding them not as distractions, but as the natural pulse of the world they lived in. They would often sit for long periods by the side of the stream, watching the water flow over the smooth gray stones. The water was clear and cold, and it moved with a mesmerizing fluidity that could hold their attention for hours. They would dip their hands into the current, feeling the coolness against their skin, and they would splash water on their faces to wash away the dust and the sweat of the morning. The sound of the running water was a white noise that drowned out all other thoughts, creating a blank and peaceful state of mind. Sometimes they would engage in the slow task of fishing, using simple spears made of sharpened wood or traps woven from reeds. They would stand perfectly still in the shallows, waiting for a fish to swim within reach, their patience infinite and their focus absolute.
The waiting was as much a part of the activity as the catching, and they were content to simply stand and breathe and be part of the river scene. Back at the cave, the fire would have burned down to a bed of glowing red coals, and the elders who had stayed behind would be tending to the camp. They would be sorting through the dried herbs and the animal skins, repairing tears in the clothing with needles made of bone and thread made of sinew. The sewing was delicate work that required good light and a steady hand, and it was done with a quiet concentration. The skins were thick and tough, and the needle had to be pushed through with force, but the rhythm of the stitch was repetitive and calming. The cave was filled with the smell of drying herbs such as sage and thyme, which hung in bundles from the rocky ceiling. These scents were earthy and pungent, and they helped to keep the air inside the cave fresh and clean. As the afternoon sun began to dip lower in the sky, the foragers would return, carrying their baskets filled with the day's harvest. They would walk up the slope to the cave, their shadows stretching long and thin ahead of them. The reunion at the cave entrance was a quiet affair, with nods and soft murmurs of greeting. They would sit together near the entrance, sorting the food and preparing the evening meal. The nuts would be cracked, and the roots would be washed, and the berries would be shared. The preparation of food was a communal activity that brought everyone together in a circle of shared effort. The fire would be built up again with fresh logs, and the flames would leap up, casting a warm glow on their faces. The cooking was slow and simple, with meat roasting on spits over the fire or stew simmering in a skin bag suspended over the heat. The smell of the cooking food would fill the cave, signaling the end of the working day and the beginning of the time for rest. They would eat slowly, savoring each bite and feeling the warmth of the food spreading through their bodies. After the meal, the pace of life would slow down even further as the darkness of night began to reclaim the land. The sky outside would turn a deep indigo, and the first stars would appear, twinkling cold and bright in the vast expanse above. The people would settle into their sleeping places on the soft furs and the dried grass. The cave walls would seem to close in around them in a protective embrace, shutting out the vastness of the universe and creating a small and safe world within. The fire would be banked for the night, covered with ash to keep the coals alive until morning. The light in the cave would fade to a soft red glow that barely illuminated the sleeping forms. The conversation would die down to a few whispered words before fading into silence. The only sound left was the slow and rhythmic breathing of the group, a collective sigh of rest that filled the cavern. The air would cool down, and the sleepers would pull their fur coverings tighter around them, seeking the warmth of the bedding and of each other. The night was a time of absolute stillness, where the body could recover from the exertions of the day, and the mind could drift into the world of dreams. The darkness was not empty, but heavy and comforting, like a thick blanket that weighed down the eyelids and stilled the thoughts. Outside, the wind might pick up, blowing through the trees and whistling softly around the rocks of the cliff face. But inside, the air was still and calm. The cave was a timeless place where the passing of hours meant nothing, and the only reality was the comfort of the present moment. Sleeping in the cave was a return to the womb of the earth, a deep and primal connection to the source of all life. The stone beneath them was solid and unmoving, a foundation that had existed for millions of years and would exist for millions more. This sense of permanence was a subconscious comfort that allowed them to sleep deeply and without fear. The cycles of the moon would mark the passage of time, with the light waxing and waning through the cave entrance. On nights of the full moon, the cave mouth would be illuminated with a ghostly silver light that reached a few feet into the interior, turning the dust motes into floating stars. On dark nights, when the moon was hidden, the blackness was total and complete, a velvet void that swallowed everything. The seasons would change slowly outside, with the green of summer giving way to the gold and red of autumn, and then to the white silence of winter. But inside the cave, the rhythm remained the same, a constant loop of waking and working and eating and sleeping. The winter months brought a different kind of quiet, as the snow would blanket the world outside, muffling all sound and making the cave feel even more isolated and secure. The days would be shorter and the nights longer, and the people would spend more time inside, sleeping for longer hours and conserving their energy. The act of walking was meditative and rhythmic, with the steady placement of one foot in front of the other and the gentle swinging of their arms. They carried woven baskets and leather pouches slung over their shoulders, ready to be filled with whatever the land provided. Sometimes they would find a patch of wild strawberries growing in a sunlit glade, and they would spend hours picking the tiny red fruits one by one. The berries were small and sweet, and their juice would stain the fingers red as they collected them with gentle care. Other times they would find a grove of nut trees, and they would gather the fallen nuts from the ground, sifting through the dry leaves to find the hard shells. The repetitive motion of bending down and picking up and straightening up was a slow dance that they performed in silence. The wind would blow through the branches above them, causing the leaves to whisper and sigh, a sound that was constant and soothing. As the day wore on, the heat would increase, and
The rain would often come in the afternoons, starting as a gentle patter on the leaves of the forest canopy, before intensifying into a steady drumming rhythm that soaked the earth. Inside the cave, the sound of the rain was distant and muffled, a soothing white noise that washed away the silence without breaking the peace. The people would sit near the entrance, watching the curtain of water fall from the rock overhang, creating a shimmering veil that blurred the view of the trees outside. The air would turn cool and moist, carrying the scent of wet stone and damp earth into the dry shelter of the cave. The rain was a time for pausing all outdoor activities and retreating into the safety of the stone home. They would watch the small rivulets of water form on the ground outside, carving tiny channels in the mud as they flowed down the hill towards the swelling stream. The gray light of the rainy day was soft on the eyes, casting no harsh shadows and creating a twilight atmosphere even in the middle of the day. The fire would hiss and pop occasionally as a stray drop of moisture found its way into the flames, but mostly it burned with a steady and comforting warmth that dried the damp air. The repetitive sound of the falling rain was nature's lullaby, a constant and unvarying tone that induced a state of drowsiness and relaxation. The children would play quietly with small stones or pieces of wood, their voices low and blending with the sound of the rain. The adults would rest their backs against the cave walls, their eyes half closed, as they listened to the storm passing over the valley. The feeling of being dry and warm while the world outside was wet and cold was a simple but profound pleasure that satisfied a deep human need for shelter. The rain could last for hours or even days, turning the world outside into a dripping green landscape of water and leaves. During these long periods of rain, the pace of life in the cave slowed down to a near standstill. There was nowhere to go and nothing urgent to do, so they simply existed in the moment, waiting for the weather to change with a patience born of necessity. They would sleep more during these times, drifting in and out of dreams as the gray light waxed and waned. The dampness outside made the furs inside feel even softer and warmer, a cozy nest against the chill. They would repair their tools with slow and deliberate movements, inspecting every edge and every binding to ensure they were perfect.
A spear shaft might be sanded smooth with a piece of rough sandstone, the friction creating a fine dust and a faint smell of wood. A leather strap might be oiled with animal fat to keep it flexible and water-resistant, the repetitive motion of rubbing the oil into the hide serving as a calming ritual. The cave was a world of textures, from the rough limestone walls to the smooth river stones to the soft animal furs and the gritty floor. The sense of touch was as important as the sense of sight in their dim world, and they knew every inch of their home by the feel of it against their skin. The back of the cave, where the light never reached, was a place of mystery and deep silence, where the air was still and timeless. Sometimes they would venture back there with a torch to store food or to seek a moment of absolute solitude. The flickering light of the torch would reveal the dripping stalactites that hung from the ceiling like stone icicles formed by the slow dripping of mineral-rich water over thousands of years. The drop of water would hang on the tip of the stone for a long moment before falling with a soft plink into a small pool on the floor. This slow geological clock ticked away the centuries in the dark, unobserved and undisturbed. The air in the deep cave was constant in temperature, never fluctuating with the seasons, a stable environment that preserved everything within it. The silence there was heavy and physical, pressing against the ears and slowing down the thoughts. Returning from the deep cave to the fire-lit circle was like returning to life from a long sleep, the warmth and the light welcoming them back. The rain would eventually stop, leaving the world glistening and bright under the breaking clouds. The sun would come out again, turning the water droplets on the leaves into tiny prisms of light. The steam would rise from the warming earth, creating low mists that drifted through the trees. The birds would start to sing again, their voices clear and loud in the washed air. The people would emerge from the cave, stretching their limbs and breathing in the fresh, clean scent of the post-rain forest. Life would resume its slow cycle of gathering and hunting and resting, but the memory of the rain would linger in the damp earth and the full streams. The nights following the rain were often clear and cold, with the stars shining with an extra brilliance in the washed sky. The fire would seem brighter and warmer on these nights, a beacon of life in the vast, dark wilderness. They would sleep deeply and without dreams, their bodies heavy and relaxed after the days of inactivity. The cave was a vessel that held them through the storms and the calms, a constant in a changing world. The routine of checking the fire and arranging the furs and closing the eyes was a ritual as old as humanity itself. The act of sleeping was not just a biological necessity, but a spiritual surrender to the night, a trust that the sun would rise again and the world would continue. The breathing of the sleepers was a soft chorus that filled the stone chamber, a song of life in the heart of the rock. The shadows cast by the dying fire would dance on the ceiling, creating shapes that morphed and changed with the movement of the embers. These shapes were the first movies, the first stories told without words to the watching eyes of the drowsy people. A shadow might look like a bison or a deer or a hunter moving across the stone canvas before fading away into the darkness. The imagination would fill in the gaps, turning the flickering light into a dreamscape that bridged the gap between waking and sleeping. The heavy eyelids would finally close, shutting out the shadows and the light, leaving only the comfort of the dark. The mind would let go of the day's memories, the image of the green forest and the gray rain and the orange fire fading into the black void of sleep. The body would sink deeper into the furs, the muscles relaxing completely and the tension melting away. The heartbeat would slow down, matching the slow rhythm of the earth itself. The sleeper was no longer a separate individual, but a part of the cave, a part of the night, a part of the ancient silence. The consciousness would drift away,
floating on a sea of tranquility where there was no time and no worry. Only the present moment existed, the sensation of warmth and safety and rest. The cave had seen generations of sleepers come and go, protecting them all with the same impartial strength. It was a home built not by hands, but by time, a shelter provided by the earth for its children. The story of the cave is a loop that never ends, a circle of stone and sleep that continues through the ages. Even now, as you lie in your bed, you are connected to those ancient sleepers by the simple act of closing your eyes and seeking rest. The darkness of your room is the same darkness that filled the cave. The silence of the night is the same silence that settled over the prehistoric valley. The need for sleep is the ancient thread that binds us all together across time and space. So let the image of the cave settle in your mind, a stable and secure place where nothing can disturb you. Let the fire fade to a soft glow, and let the rain tap gently on the leaves outside. Let the breathing of the tribe surround you with a sense of belonging and safety. You are safe here in the deep quiet of the story. You are warm and protected and ready to sleep. The stone walls are strong, and the night is long, and the rest is waiting for you. Sleep now and join the ancient rhythm of the earth. Sleep and drift into the peaceful dark.
The seasons would turn like a slow and heavy wheel, bringing the change that was inevitable and quiet. The green leaves of the forest would turn to gold and brown, drifting down from the branches to carpet the earth in a thick layer of rustling color. The air would grow crisp and sharp, biting at the nose and fingers when the people stepped outside. The preparation for the long cold would begin in earnest, a time of gathering and storing and waiting. They would collect great piles of wood, stacking them near the cave entrance to dry, forming a wall of timber that blocked the wind. The nuts and dried meats were packed into the crevices of the rock, high up where the rodents could not reach them. The days grew shorter, with the sun taking a lower path across the pale sky, casting long and weak shadows that stretched across the valley. The light had a thin and watery quality that stripped the warmth from the stone. Then the first snow would fall, usually in the silence of the night, starting as a few stray flakes drifting in the wind before thickening into a heavy white curtain. The world outside would be transformed into a landscape of soft curves and white mounds. The sharp edges of the rocks and the tangled branches of the undergrowth were smoothed over by the blanket of snow. The silence of winter was different from the silence of the night. It was a muffled and absolute deadening of sound, where even the footsteps were swallowed by the soft powder. Inside the cave, the sense of isolation was complete. The entrance was a bright rectangle of blinding white light that contrasted sharply with the dim interior. The fire was kept large and roaring, its heat reflecting off the stone walls to combat the creeping chill that tried to enter from the outside. The people moved less during these months, their bodies adapting to the season of rest. They would sit for hours wrapped in their heavy furs, barely moving except to feed the fire or to shift their position. The cave became a warm cocoon, a place of hibernation where time seemed to stop completely. The only measure of time was the dwindling pile of wood and the slow burning of the logs. They would watch the flames consume the wood, observing the wood turn from brown to black to glowing red ash. The crackle of the fire was loud in the stillness, a sharp sound that emphasized the quiet. The smoke would rise in lazy spirals, drifting towards the roof, where it hung in a thin blue haze before escaping. The smell of the cave in winter was a mix of wood smoke and curing leather and the musk of unwashed bodies, a scent that was familiar and comforting. The nights were incredibly long, stretching out for what felt like forever. They would sleep for 12 or 14 hours at a time, drifting in and out of a shallow doze. The dreams in winter were vivid and long, filled with the memories of the green summer and the hunt. Sometimes the wind would howl around the entrance, driving snow into the front of the cave, where it would hiss as it hit the warm stones of the hearth. But deep inside, the air was still and protected. The cold was a presence that lived outside, a beast that stalked the valley but could not enter their fortress. The feeling of warmth was a physical pleasure that they savored, feeling it penetrate their skin and relax their muscles. The heavy furs were like a second skin, weighing them down and anchoring them to the earth. The simple act of existence was enough in the winter. There was no need to achieve or to do. The goal was simply to endure and to wait for the return of the sun. The boredom of the long confinement was not a source of stress, but a state of being, a trance-like condition where the mind emptied itself of thought. They would stare at the stone walls, tracing the cracks and the bumps with their eyes, finding patterns in the rock face. A crack might look like a river or a snake winding its way across the surface. A bump might look like the sun or a face. These small visual details became their entertainment, their library, and their art. The rhythmic breathing of the group was the metronome of the cave, a slow and steady beat that regulated their lives. The heart rate slowed down, and the metabolism dropped, a biological response to the season of scarcity. They were like the bears sleeping in their dens, waiting for the signal to wake. The connection to the animal world was strong, as they shared the same strategies for survival. The snow outside would deepen, piling up against the cliffs and changing the shape of the land. The trees stood like black skeletons against the white sky, their branches bare and frozen. Occasionally, a heavy load of snow would slide off a branch with a soft thud, but otherwise the forest was motionless. The water in the stream would freeze over, leaving only a thin trickle flowing beneath the ice. The task of getting water became harder, requiring them to break the ice with heavy stones. The water was painfully cold, numbing the hands and the throat, but it was pure and clean, tasting of the minerals of the earth. The return to the warm cave after the brief exposure to the freezing cold was a moment of intense relief. The skin would tingle as the blood rushed back to the surface, and the fire would feel hotter than ever. The sharing of food was done with care, as the supplies had to last until the thaw. They would chew the dried meat slowly, making it last, savoring the flavor and the sustenance. The hunger was a dull ache that was always present but manageable, a part of the winter reality. The body consumed its own reserves, growing leaner and harder as the weeks passed, but the mind remained calm and clear, focused only on the present. There was no anxiety about the future, because the cycle of the seasons was a guarantee. The spring would come, it always did, and the snow would melt and the green would return. This faith in the natural order allowed them to relax completely and to surrender to the long wait. The winter was a time of healing, a time for the body to repair itself from the hard work of the year. The minor injuries and the aches and pains would fade away in the long periods of rest. The cave was a hospital of sleep, where the cure for everything was stillness and warmth. The darkness of the cave was a velvet curtain that shut out the glare of the snow, allowing the eyes to rest. The flickering firelight created a hypnotic display that lulled the brain into a state of alpha waves. The boundary between being awake and being asleep was blurred, and they existed in a twilight zone of consciousness. The stories told around the fire were slow and repetitive, recounting the deeds of ancestors and the habits of animals. The voices were low and monotonous, lacking the energy of the summer months. The listeners would nod and drift off, the words blending into the background noise of the fire. The sense of community was strongest in the winter, as they relied on each other for warmth and company. The physical closeness was a necessity and a comfort, a tangle of limbs and furs that created a collective heat. The breathing of one person would influence the breathing of the others until the whole group breathed in unison, a single organism resting in the heart of the rock. The cave was the womb and the tomb and the home, all in one, the place where life was preserved against the hostility of the elements. As you visualize this scene, feel the heavy weight of the winter blankets on your own body. Feel the cool air on your face and the warmth surrounding you. Imagine the absolute silence of the snow-covered world, where no cars or sirens or voices can reach. There is only the wind and the snow and the stone. The world has stopped turning and everything is still. You are safe in the cave of your bed, protected from the cold and the noise. The fire is burning steadily within you, keeping you warm and alive. The long winter sleep is calling you, a deep and dreamless slumber that will restore you. Let go of the need to move or to think. Just be like the ancient ones waiting out the winter. Let the snow fall and cover the world in white silence. Let the fire burn low and the shadows lengthen. Let the eyes close and the breath slow. Sink into the furs, sink into the stone, sink into the sleep.
The change would start not with a sound, but with a feeling in the air, a subtle shifting of the wind that carried a hint of moisture and a promise of warmth. The hard edge of the cold would begin to soften, and the biting frost would lose its sting. The sun would linger a little longer in the sky each day, pushing back the shadows and eating away at the edges of the snow. The icicles that hung like jagged teeth from the cave entrance would begin to weep, releasing single drops of water that fell with a rhythmic plink onto the stone below. This sound of dripping water would become the new soundtrack of the cave, a steady and optimistic beat that marked the passage of the season. The white blanket of snow would begin to retreat, revealing patches of wet black earth that smelled of damp soil and sleeping roots. The world was waking up from its long slumber, stretching and yawning in the growing light. The river, which had been a silent ribbon of ice, would groan and crack as the water beneath surged with new energy, breaking the shackles of the winter. The chunks of ice would float downstream, colliding with soft thuds and dissolving slowly into the dark current. The people in the cave would feel the change in their bones, a lightening of the spirit and a return of energy. They would stand at the entrance, blinking in the bright sunlight, breathing in the smell of the thaw, which was the smell of life returning. The first green shoots would push their way up through the mud, pale and tender, but driven by an unstoppable force. The birds would return from their southern migrations, their songs filling the silence of the valley with complex melodies that echoed off the cliff faces. The silence of winter was replaced by the busy sounds of spring, the buzzing of early insects and the rustling of small animals in the undergrowth. The fire in the cave would be allowed to burn lower, no longer needed for survival, but still kept as a center of comfort and cooking. The heavy furs would be shaken out and aired, their winter duty done. The people would move with more freedom, their limbs loose and active after the long confinement. They would walk down to the river to wash away the smoke and the dust of the winter, feeling the cold water wake up their skin. The water was still freezing, but it felt cleansing and invigorating, a baptism of the new year. The gathering would begin again with the first tender greens and the early bulbs providing a welcome break from the diet of dried meat and nuts. The taste of the fresh food was vibrant and shocking to the palate, a burst of flavor that signaled the return of plenty. The forest floor would become a carpet of wildflowers, blue and yellow and white, nodding in the gentle breeze. The bees would emerge from their hives, groggy but determined, beginning their endless work of pollination. The cycle of life was spinning again, turning the wheel from death to life, from cold to heat, from sleep to wakefulness. The cave remained the constant anchor in this shifting sea of time, the stone walls watching the seasons come and go with an indifference born of eternity. The spring rains would come, warm and gentle, washing the last of the dirty snow from the crevices and turning the moss on the rocks a brilliant emerald green. The smell of the rain on the warm earth was a perfume that no modern chemist could replicate, a scent that triggered deep memories of survival and growth. The days would lengthen until the sun seemed to hang in the sky forever, the golden light bathing the valley in a warm glow. The children would run in the tall grass, their laughter mixing with the sound of the wind. The adults would sit in the sun, repairing their nets and their spears, their hands busy, but their minds at peace. The urgency of the winter prep was gone, replaced by the steady rhythm of daily maintenance. The cave was now a cool retreat from the midday sun, a place of shade and rest where the air remained refreshing. The dust motes would dance in the shafts of sunlight that pierced the gloom, illuminating the paintings on the walls. The bison and the deer and the mammoth immortalized in stone, a testament to the relationship between the hunter and the prey. The evenings would remain cool, requiring the comfort of the fire and the closeness of the group. They would sit and watch the sunset, the sky turning a bruised purple and orange before fading into the star-filled black. The constellations had shifted their positions in the sky, marking the passage of the year, a celestial calendar that the early humans read with ease. They knew the stars as well as they knew the forest, using them to navigate and to tell time. The night sky was a vast map of stories and myths, a screen on which they projected their questions and their dreams. Sleeping in the spring was different from the winter sleep. It was lighter and shorter, filled with the anticipation of the morning. The dreams were of running and hunting and green spaces, reflecting the expanding world outside. Yet the comfort of the cave remained the same. The hard floor made soft by the furs, the protective walls, the sense of belonging. The routine of sleep was the thread that connected every day of their lives, a pause in the action that allowed the body to recover. As the story winds down, let yourself feel the transition from the cold winter to the warm spring. Feel the imaginary sun warming your skin and the gentle breeze moving your hair. Let the sound of the dripping, melting snow lull you deeper into relaxation. The water is washing away your stress just as it washes away the winter grime. The green shoots are pushing up through your mind, replacing worry with hope and peace. The cave is still there, waiting for you, a place in your mind where you can always go to find safety and silence. The fire is still burning, a small golden light in the center of the dark. The ancient sleepers are still there, breathing slowly and rhythmically in time with the earth. You are part of this long, unbroken chain of human rest. Your sleep is natural and necessary and good. The world will keep turning while you sleep. The seasons will change. The sun will rise. But for now, you can just be. Be still like the stone. Be quiet like the winter snow. Be warm like the spring sun. The story has no end because the cycle has no end. It just goes round and round, a comforting loop of existence. So close your eyes and let the image of the cave fade into the soft darkness behind your eyelids. Let the words lose their meaning and become just a soothing sound, a drone that carries you away, down into the deep and dreamless dark. Sleep now, sleep.
The full weight of summer would settle over the valley, turning the lush green world into a place of shimmering heat and bright, intense light. The sun would climb to its zenith and hang there suspended in the blue void, baking the earth and the stones until they radiated a heat it could be felt through the soles of the feet. The air would be thick and still, filled with the sound of a million insects, the cicadas clicking their rhythmic song in the trees, and the bees droning heavily among the wildflowers. This background hum of nature was a constant vibration that seemed to permeate the very air itself. Inside the cave, the temperature remained perfectly cool, a natural refuge that defied the scorching world outside. The heavy stone walls acted as an insulator, absorbing the heat of the day and keeping the interior dark and refreshing. The contrast between the blinding white light of the valley and the dim, soothing gray of the cave was a daily relief. The people would retreat into the shadows during the hottest hours of the day, moving slowly and speaking in hushed tones to conserve their energy. They would lie on the cool floor, pressing their skin against the smooth rock to lower their body temperature. The dogs that lived with them would pant softly in the corners, their tongues lolling out. The pace of life slowed down to match the heat, with no unnecessary movement or exertion. The work was done in the early morning or the late evening, when the sun was low and the air was bearable. The river became the center of their social life, a place to cool off and to wash and to play. The water was no longer icy, but tepid and inviting, flowing slowly over the sun-warmed rocks. They would wade into the current, feeling the water swirl around their legs and wash away the sweat and the dust. The children would splash and dive, their laughter echoing off the water, while the adults floated on their backs, looking up at the passing clouds. The sensation of weightlessness in the water was a luxury that relaxed the muscles and soothed the joints. After swimming, they would sit on the riverbank, letting the sun dry their skin. The smell of the river mud and the drying vegetation was heavy and sweet, a scent of abundance and growth. The summer was a time of plenty, where food was easy to find and the struggle for survival eased. The berry bushes were heavy with fruit, blackberries and raspberries and blueberries that stained the hands and the mouth. The game was plentiful and fat from the grazing. The anxiety of the winter was a distant memory, replaced by the lazy contentment of the summer. The days were incredibly long, with the sun setting late in the evening, stretching the twilight into a long purple haze. The fire was built outside the cave entrance on these warm nights, serving more as a gathering point than a source of heat. They would sit around the small flames, roasting meat and sharing stories, while the fireflies began to blink in the tall grass. The tiny wandering lights of the insects mirrored the stars that were beginning to appear in the darkening sky. The night air remained warm and balmy, sitting soft on the skin like a light blanket. They would sleep with fewer furs, often just lying on the woven grass mats. The cave entrance would be left open to catch the slightest breeze that might stir the air. The sounds of the summer night were loud and busy, with the calling of owls and the chirping of crickets and the rustling of nocturnal animals. Yet these sounds were familiar and safe, a lullaby that had been sung for thousands of years. The sleep in summer was deep and heavy, induced by the heat and the fullness of the belly. The dreams were slow and languid, drifting like the summer clouds. The connection to the earth was felt most strongly in this season, as they lived almost entirely outdoors, only using the cave for sleep. The sun turned their skin a deep, rich brown and bleached their hair. They were part of the landscape as much as the trees and the rocks, moving in harmony with the rhythms of the day. The thunderstorms of summer were violent and sudden, exploding with crashes of thunder that shook the ground and flashes of lightning that lit up the cave like broad daylight. They would huddle together at the back of the cave, watching the raw power of nature with a mix of fear and awe. The rain would fall in sheets, turning the entrance into a waterfall and cooling the air instantly. The smell of ozone and wet stone would fill the cave, a sharp and clean scent that cleared the head. After the storm, the air would be fresh and cool, and the world would glisten with moisture. The cycle of heat and storm and heat again was the heartbeat of the season. The repetition of the days was a comfort, a guarantee that life was proceeding as it should. The simple tasks of gathering wood and water and food were the anchors of their sanity, keeping them grounded in the physical world. The weaving of baskets and the knapping of flint were done with a slow, meditative focus, the hands knowing the work so well that the mind could wander. They would hum low, formless tunes as they worked, the vibrations resonating in their chests. The cave was a container for their lives, holding their memories and their dreams within its rocky embrace. The dust on the floor was mixed with the pollen of 1,000 summers, a microscopic record of the passing years. The soot on the ceiling was a history of 1,000 fires, written in black carbon. The people were transient, passing through the time, but the cave was eternal, witnessing it all with a stony silence. As you lie there, listening to this endless summer, allow the warmth of the imaginary sun to penetrate your muscles, relaxing them completely. Feel the cool water of the river washing over you, carrying away your tension and your stress. Hear the drone of the cicadas, a white noise that blocks out the worries of the modern world. See the fireflies dancing in the night, tiny sparks of magic in the night. The cave is waiting for you, cool and dark and safe. The bed you lie in is your cave, your sanctuary, your fortress against the world. The heavy heat of the summer day has passed, and now it is time for the cool rest of the night. Let your breathing slow down to match the slow flow of the river. Let your heart rate drop to the rhythm of the earth. There is nothing to do and nowhere to go. The berries are gathered, the wood is stacked, the fire is burning low. Everything is done and everything is right. You can let go now. You can drift away. The ancient sleepers are drifting with you, a silent company of ancestors watching over your rest. The night is long and the peace is deep, and the sleep is waiting. Close your eyes and sink into the stone. Sink into the cool dark. Sink into the quiet. Sleep.